Okay, so today we're going to look at the labor force participation rate and unemployment. Well, the labor force really just consists of all employed and unemployed persons in the country at any given time. So all the people really in the country who are employed or unemployed, they're also known as the workforce. So those are the people in the country who are able to work, whether they're employed or whether they're not employed, right? And then there's working age population. Working age population is the number of people in an economy age 15 or over. So anyone who's above the age of 15 will be qualified within the working age population. I would write this definition down. Then we've got the labor force participation rate. So in Australia, anyone over the age of 15 is a potential participant of the workforce. If you're below 15, you're not really required to work as such, so you won't really be a part of the workforce. However, people can decide not to be a part of the workforce or not to participate in the labor force because they want to travel or they want to study full time or they just don't want to, be in the country. They want to go outside of the country or whatever it is. Because of that, they will not be added in the labor force participation rate. Then we've got the labor force. Well, LFPR really just stands for the labor force participation rate. So the labor force participation rate can be defined as, sorry, I'm just trying to get the highlighter. So the labor force participation rate can be defined as a percentage of civilian population aged 15 or over who are in the workforce. Again, kids who are age 15 or over will be a part of the labor force, right? And they're also a part of the workforce. So if you're Australian and you're 20 years old, but you're not living in Australia, then you won't really be added in the labor force participation rate. Those who are either working or actively seeking work will be added. But people who are not actively seeking work, for instance, the ones who want to study full-time or the ones who want to travel and then come back, they will not be added in the labor force participation rate. And here we've got the formula for the labor force participation rate, which is labor force divided by population age 15 or over into 100. Okay, please write this down. Now then we've got the overall participation rate has risen slowly over the past 3 decades. That basically means that over the past 3 decades, the labor force participation rate has risen. That means that more people are now willing to work or looking for work. So we've gone from 61% to 66%, a record high that was achieved in 2019. Please keep in mind that everything that I'm highlighting, you need to write. Okay, so there have been significant changes to the male and female participation rates. Obviously, if you actually really just look at the Australian labour force overall over the past few decades, you'll see that the male or men have basically stopped working as much compared to women. So the male participation rate has dropped from 80% in the early 1970s to only 71% in 2018-2019. So that's really just gone down. A lot of men are actually not working now as compared to before. And if you actually compare that to females have shown a strong upward trend, driven particularly because particularly by the increasing participation of married women in the workforce. So again, a lot more women are working now compared to how it was back in the days. Participation rates of both men and women changed dramatically in the 1970s and the 1980s. And they have increased over the past few decades. Also keep in mind that it also depends on the birth rate as well, or the gender. A lot more women are being born now compared to men, and that basically also kind of adds into the fact that that's why we have a lot more women in the labor force participation rate. But overall, it's just mainly because the women have gotten more freedom, and now they're more inclined to work compared to men. So this is basically a table that shows you the male and female participation overall in Australia. And if you see in 1970 it was around 83% for men, and now it's only 71%. So it's been going down dramatically. And if you look at women in 1970 it was 39%, and now it's around 60%, which is pretty good. So women have increased and men have basically decreased. Now, there are certain things that influence the labor force participation rate. And we're just going to classify them as short-term influences and then long-term influences. Now, first, let's just look at the short-term influences of the labor force participation rate. So labor force participation rate is said to be pro-cyclical. That basically means that in times of, and that's exactly what's happening right now, in times of economic prosperity, basically when the economy is performing really, really well, for instance, in the mining boom, people are more inclined to look for work because they know that there are businesses who are willing to hire employees regardless of their, well, not really regardless of their job, of their experience or whatever. That is still looked into, but at that point there's a very, very high demand for labor, right? And that's what it's saying over here. In times of economic prosperity, people will be encouraged to actively seek work since there are better prospects of finding a job. And if you actually compare that to a recession, something very similar to what we're going through right now because of the COVID-19, we know that a lot of businesses have closed down. A lot of businesses are not able to perform as well as they were before, which is why, as an employee, I would not be inclined to change my job or really just look for a job if I'm not working at all. Because I know that there's a very low chance for me to find work since businesses are not performing very well. Why would they want to hire me? They don't really need staff at that point. So that's when you're kind of not really encouraged to look for work. You're really discouraged. No one's saying that to you, but you just feel it because of the whole economic condition, right? And that's what it says over here. However, in a recession, people are less optimistic and therefore less inclined to find work. So that was the short-term factor that influences the labor force participation rate. If we actually look at the long-term factors, there are many of those. So the long-term influences on labor force participation rate. The first thing is aging of the population. We're all aware of the fact that Australia mainly has an aging population, and that's kind of reducing our labor force. In the sense that if we read over here, well, trends in the aging of population and the age of retirement are long-term influences on participation rate. So if you read here, projected decline in the participation rate from 62 to 65 to 62% in 2054 and 55. So basically, there's going to be a decrease in participation rate of around 3% in the year 2055. And this is mainly because of the fact that we have an aging population. That means that a lot of people who are working right now, by the time that they reach 2050 or 2055, they'll have retired. They won't be working anymore. Hence, the whole participation rate kind of reduces because you won't be added in the workforce as such because you would have retired. So even the participation rates among the population age 15 to 64 are expected to rise by 76.2% in 2015 to all the way to 79% in 2055, and more people are beginning to delay retirement because they want to work more. Overall participation among the population age 15 will actually decrease. Because the significant growth in the proportion of the population age 65 or older, and that's what I said as well, that there are a lot of people now, or a lot of people by the time we hit 2050 will be above 65. Australia has basically an aging population. We don't have a lot of young people over here. We have people currently I think Australia's mean age, I think it was between 35 to 38 year olds. So by the time they reach 2050, they're going to be a lot more older and they won't be able to work even if they want to work at that point, right? So the overall trend in the aging population is going to impact the labor force participation rate in the long term, right? Changes in social attitudes, and this brings it back to the fact that women are working a lot more now, right? So the role of women in work, coupled with improved provision of childcare and declining birth rates, have seen an increasing tendency for married women to participate in workforce. Especially when it comes to childcare, it's a lot more easier for married women to really just leave their child in childcare now, because they're just readily available. It's just very much easy for you to just get your child into childcare as compared to the past. Hence, you're more inclined to work, along with the fact that, you know, women have gotten their freedom a lot more now. People are more open to them working compared to how it was in the 19th century or whatever it is. And that kind of has encouraged women to work more, and that's basically one of the main changes in social attitudes towards women, and which is great. Increase in school retention rates, that basically just means that a lot more people are not leaving school now compared to the past. In the past, education was not as important, or maybe it was, but a lot of people would leave school at an early age, and that's not happening anymore, which is working really well for us. Because basically the proportion of Australians with a university degree has risen from 23% in the generation that is now aged 55 to 56. So it's moved from 23% to 39% for the people aged 25 to 34. So again, you can obviously see a massive increase in people who value university degrees, or who want a university degree. And comparative study says that 43% of Australians aged between 25 and 64 have obtained some level of post-secondary school qualification, significantly above the OECD average. So again, a lot more people aged 25 to 64 have actually received a university qualification or a diploma, really, and that has seen the labor force participation rate actually grow. And the main reason for that is because the more educated you are, the better it is for you to, the higher chances there are for you to actually find work. And that's something that we'll cover later on when we go forward. Now, there are a couple of other factors that impact the labor force participation rate. One of them is actually migration or immigration. Now, Australia, because it's a massive country, it's a very, very big country, and Australia massively had a shortage of skilled labor over the past few years, right? Australia's immigration policies are heavily weighted towards skilled migrants. Basically, what Australia would do is they would just take in migrants from other countries, whatever country they're from, as long as they're skilled, as long as they have a university degree and they're experienced in a certain educational field, they were allowed to come into Australia and work over here. Right, and that has also seen the labor force participation rate move upwards. And the main reason for that is because those migrants then come into Australia and then they settle down over here for a better life or whatever it is. And that kind of adds them into the labor force participation or into the workforce, and that increases the labor force participation rate overall, right? In 2016-2017, more than 2 out of 3 newcomers under Australia's migration program were given entry basis of their skills. Skilled migrants enter because they have skills which are short in supply in Australia, basically what we just discussed. Now, with that being said, when we actually look at migration in Australia, what do you think is happening right now because of COVID-19? We know that we're kind of hitting a recession. We know that a lot of businesses have closed down. The economy is well suffering. The government is great for helping us out. The government has given a lot of fiscal stimulus to people, a lot of money to businesses so that they can help boost up the economy in some way. But what's really happening to migration? If you actually look at around just last week itself, actually 3 days ago itself, Scott Morrison actually came up and then he said that there's going to be a massive decrease in migration in Australia. If you compare 2018-2019 within that fiscal year, and if you compare that to 2019-2020 fiscal year, there was a 30% decrease in migration. So compared to 2018, 2019, 2020, there was a 30% decrease. And that's basically because, again, that's got to do a lot with government policies. We had too many skilled migrants, and that's what the government was trying not to get too many migrants from overseas. But now with COVID-19, a lot of people are leaving the country because of, the whole economic situation. A lot of them have lost their jobs and they're moving back to their country. And it's said that in 2020, 2021, this fiscal year, will have an 85% decrease in migration compared to the 2018-2019 year. And that is massive. That's around 300,000 people who are going to be leaving the country. Because of COVID-19. That's a massive impact on Australia. That basically means that once again we will have a shortage of skilled labor. Once again Australia will be looking for skilled laborers, and that's going to make the economy suffer. Along with it, and again, the government is doing everything that they can. They've given us fiscal stimulus, to businesses, to all the businesses, businesses in Australia, and that is actually costing the money, not just the fiscal stimulus, along with the unemployment benefits and all of that, and that's costing the government around $4 billion a week. That's how much they're losing because of the help they're giving to people. Right, that is obviously just going to put us in debt, as in the government in debt, and then over time they'll have to pay off that debt. Please write this down. Now, lastly, if you look at a lot of other professional organizations that handle, basically in Australia, what you really need is that if, for instance, if you want to be a teacher, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to go into medicine, if you want to go for engineering, whatever it is, there's always a body that looks after that, right? So for instance, for teachers, we have a teaching body that looks after teachers. And you have to comply by the rules of the teaching body. You can't just randomly be a teacher. You have to comply by the rules. And those rules are only just making things kind of harder for people. Those rules are really good overall for the workforce, but that's might be discouraging for people to actually find work. So if you look over here, professional associations such as Law Society, the Australian Medical Association, and the Institute of Engineers impose standards of education, continuing training and professional conduct on their members, and this tends to restrict the supply of labor to these occupations. That's because it's very difficult for you to keep up with that education standard and that training and professional standard, and that kind of discourages people to work, or that makes things kind of harder for engineers or doctors or whatever it is to keep up with that. Right? And then we're going to look at the Australian labour force. So unemployment refers to a situation where individuals want to work but they're unable to find a job. As a result, labor resources in the economy are not utilized. So unemployment is really when you want to work but you're not able to find work because of whatever reason it is. And you could be a skilled labor, but then again, you just can't find a job, right? And we're just going to look at who is included in all of this. So people, and again, how we discussed, age 15 and over, employed for at least one. And by the way, sorry, we're talking about the labor force. Okay, so who is in and who is not in the labor force. Again, someone who's age 15 or over, or who is employed at least for 1 hour a week, you'll be part of the labor force. Or you're on paid leave, or you're on strike or workers' compensation, or basically you're just being paid by your employer, you'll still be a part of the labor force. Or you're unemployed and you're actively seeking work and available for work, you will still be a part of the labor force. People who are not a part of the labor force are basically retired from workforce, and that brings us back to the aging population bit. The reason our population or labor force participation rate is going to decline in 2050 is basically because a lot of people who are working now will have retired at that time. And that would kind of reduce the labor force participation rate because you're not a part of the labor force, right? You're age 15 or under, so you're under the age of 15. You're performing full-time domestic duties, means you don't want to work. You're full-time non-working students. You are over the age of 15, but you're not working. You're just studying completely. You're without a job, but not available for or not actively seeking work. So you don't have a job and you're not looking for a job either because you just don't want to work. You will not be a part of the labor force. Then we're just going to look at the size and quality of the workforce. So we're just going to look at the overall population size, and we've discussed that a bit earlier as well. So you've got the overall population over here. Within the overall population, you'll have the working age population, which are people above the age of 15. And within the working age population, you will have the workforce. And then within the workforce, you'll have people who are employed, and then you have people who are unemployed, right? Okay, so the size of our population gives us a starting point for determining the size of the workforce. The larger the total population, the greater the potential of the workforce, obviously. Over time, then our nation's population tends to increase. Obviously, it is going to increase over time because of increasing birth rates and all of that. And again, the more people you have, the more your labor force will be. Population growth is influenced by two primary factors. One is natural increase and the other one is net migration. We've discussed net migration already. Natural increase is just naturally increasing the workforce because of more birth. Net migration is you taking more people from overseas because you're skilled migrants, having them come over here and work for you. They will also obviously be a part of the labor force, and that kind of sums up the Australian population size, right? So if you actually look at Australia, population growth in Australia since 19th century, so you've got natural increase and then you've got net migration. As you can see, natural increase has been there. It's been increasing and decreasing, increasing and decreasing. Currently, it's kind of decreasing over here. And if you actually look at the net migration was quite low in the 19th century. It increased a bit. In the 1950s, went low again. In the 1970s, it went really high in the 1990s. And why do you think that was? The main reason it went really high in the 1990s is mainly because there was a recession in Australia, very similar to what's happening right now. A massive recession in Australia, I think 1991, 1992. Because of that, we kind of lacked skilled workforce, and that's when Australia decided to take in more migrants. And again, that decreased over the years. It increased massively again after the GFC. And again, that's because GFC we didn't really have a recession in Australia, but it was a very big economic decline. And because of that, we needed to boost up the economy, hence why we actually took in more people from overseas. If you look at now, it was actually increasing quite a lot in 2017, 2018, but now they decided to decrease it. The graph only goes till 2018, but 2019, again, as I said, there was a 30% decrease, and right now, 2020, 2021, there's going to be around a 85% decrease. So that's going to be a massive decline in the graph. Okay, so if you look at the distribution of Australia's population, you've got people who are 0 to 14 who are not as much. If you see people between 15 to 64 are a lot more compared to people who are below 15 and who are above 65. Again, but then this figure is going to increase over the next few years, mainly just because, as we discussed, Australia has an aging population and they'll only just become more older, and that's going to decrease our labor force. Okay, age distribution. Again, coming back to what we discussed, currently the population is beginning to decline after increasing for several decades. That's because post-war baby boomers. The baby boom basically happened after the war, and that means that at that time a lot of babies were born, and now they're currently working. They were working over the past few years. Now they're currently retiring, and that is declining our labor force, right? Again, there has been a decrease of population of people under the age of 15 and an increase in population of the people over the age of 65. That's something to note. So under 15 we don't have many of them, and over 65 we have a lot of them. So again, we have a massive inconsistency of people of different ages, and that's kind of impacting our workforce. Median age between 1991 to 2016 has increased from 32 to 38 years, mainly due to declining birth rates and increasing life expectancy. A lot of kids are not being born now compared to before, for whatever reasons it is. And that is really just declining the birth rate and also increasing life expectancy. That basically means that there's a higher chance for you to live now because of all the medical facilities that we have over here. And that is also because Australia has an aging population. Those people are living a lot more now, alhamdulillah. While the size of Australian workforce grew by around 2 million during the 2000s decade, the workforce is expected to grow only by 200,000 during the 2020s. Compare that to 2 million. That's really, really less. In other words, at the current rate of immigration and births, Australia's workforce will be growing at less than 1/10 of its growth rate in recent years. So that's really, really less. This could put a significant constraint in future economic growth. That basically just means that we will have less workers now. We won't have a lot of people working for us, and that's really just going to make our economy suffer. And I guess that's when the government will decide to move on to immigration again, because we just need people who can boost up the economy, who can work a lot more, who are skilled as well. Okay, education patterns. We've discussed this very briefly before as well. In the 10 years to 2018, there was a 6% point increase in proportion of young workers aged 25 to 34 with the post-school qualification. That basically means that a lot more people are getting degrees after school, so they've decided to go to university or TAFE or whatever it is and get themselves a qualification, rising from 69 to 75%, which is absolutely great. Nevertheless, only 65% of Australians aged 25 to 64 have completed secondary school education, so we still have people who only have completed secondary school education, which is also great again. Australia's public spending on education is slightly above international standards, so we actually pay a lot more at university compared to other countries. And again, that brings me back of migration and international students, and we've discussed this in class as well. International students pay a lot more than regular Australians do, and that is basically one form of that's a way that the government makes a lot of money as well. And again, that's massively declining now because of COVID-19, and that is a massive loss to Australia, to the Australian economy. And 34% of total education spending is privately funded in Australia. And yes, that is it. So we're done with this. Sorry, I forgot to look at that. Impact of education attainment. And obviously, if you see over here, if you only studied, and that's average weekly earnings, and you've got the education level. If you studied in year 11 or below than that, your income level is going to be a lot lower than someone who's done a postgraduate degree, right? So the more you study, the more you get paid. That's what it is. Now, we're just going to very briefly look at labor markets. I think we've already done this. We've kind of covered it, but anyway, let's just briefly look at the demand for labor. The demand for labor is basically when firms demand labor, and that only just happens because it's a derived demand. That it happens when there's an increase in demand for goods and services. That in turn means that the firms have to create more, and in order to create more, they need more people to work for them. Right, so let's just look at this, an increase in the demand of labor. And obviously, let's say if our original point is D1 over here, okay, never mind, the original point is D1 over here. An increase in D1 is basically just going to mean that the demand curve has moved from D1 to D2, and a decrease in labor will mean that the demand curve has moved from D1 to D3. And if you can see an increase for labor, basically also increases the wages. A decrease for labor decreases the wages as well. And that's in labor demand, basically. Okay, factors which increase the demand of labor. The first one is output of the firm increases. So because the firms need to produce more, they need more labor, as we discussed earlier. That's going to make them want to hire more people. Productivity of labor increases. If the productivity of labor basically increases, that means that firms are producing a lot more. They're really happy. If they're producing more, customers are buying more. Things are going really well, and the customers are buying more. The firms need to produce even a lot more, and that's when they're going to hire more people. And that is why that increases the demand for labor, right? And cost of other inputs increases. Obviously, if you're looking at machinery, who could replace labor, if they're really expensive compared to labor, you're not going to get the machinery. You're going to just keep on working with the laborers. You're just going to hire labor then, and that is going to increase the demand for labor. A decrease of demand labor. Factors that will decrease the demand for labor. The first one is output of the firm. Again, the exact same thing, but just opposite. So that if the output of the firm decreases, they don't need as many people. They're just going to fire people. That's going to decrease the demand. That's what's happening right now. Productivity of the labor decreases. If you're not as productive, you're not contributing as much to the business, and if you're not contributing to the business isn't performing very well. Because of that, they don't need you, and they're just not going to hire you, right? And that's what's happening right now as well. Cost of other inputs as well. If their cost is very low, if it's cheaper for you to buy capital, you might as well just go and buy that and not hire labor, because they can do the exact same job and they're just cheaper. So a business is always going to look at what's cheaper. Moving on to the supply for labor, the exact same thing. So you have the supply curve over here. An increase in supply basically means that the wage is less and the quantity is more. And again, when you look at the demand from the for labor, you look at the perspective of a business from the perspective of business. And if you look at the supply of labor, you look at it from the perspective of a labor itself, or of an employee, right? So if there are too many teachers out there who need a particular position, that basically means that businesses have too many options to pick from, and they can pay you whatever they want to, right? That is why your wage decreases, because they're open. If, like, for instance, if they don't wanna hire you, they won't hire you. They have 10 other options to pick from, and whoever they pick should be happy with the wage that they're getting. Again, factors that increase the supply of labor: pay and remuneration increases. If there's more pay, more people will want to come and work. Hence, the supply for labor increases. Working conditions improve. Again, same thing. Human capital, skills, experience, education, training levels, they all decrease. For instance, if you know that you don't have enough training, you don't have enough education, you don't have much of the skills which are required for you, from you, generally speaking, the labor supply is going to increase, because a lot of those people know that they can't get a job and they really want to get a job. Hence why they will come and then they'll apply for those jobs, because they just really need it. They know they're not really, for instance, if I want to, or if a person who's been working as a janitor wants to apply to be, the CEO of a company, not going to happen as much, right? So the whole point is that if you know that you don't have enough training, you don't have enough education, you need a job, you're desperate for a job, that's going to increase your supply, because you just need a job, you need to work somewhere, right? Occupation and geographic mobility of labor increases, so basically means that you are willing to move around a lot more for your jobs, to go to different states and countries to work, and you don't mind that, so that's going to increase your demand, your supply. And participation rate increases as well. That basically means that overall the country has too many people to work, who want to work, and that basically just increases the supply of labor. And the decrease in the supply of labor is the opposite.